Here we go. We're starting with a 0-point field because it's quintessential to understanding the rest of this theory. The Casimir effect is when you put these two metal plates less than a micrometer from each other, which is very minuscule. And essentially, the idea is that if it's in a vacuum, there's nothing that should happen because there's no matter in there. But what does happen is because they're so close together, only little tiny wavelengths can fit in there, and the larger ones on the outside, is that the metal plates collapse, which proves that quantum energy exists without matter. That quantum energy without matter is the ZPF. That's everywhere, all the time. This is the medium that Hal Puthoff points to that is responsible for inertia, gravity, time, and consciousness. Inertia is the easiest one to explain, but essentially if you were in a vacuum and you still accelerated very fast, you're going to feel resistance, and that's due to this medium. Like you would in water, if you try to go fast, you're going to feel resistance. Let's stay on the Hal Puthoff train because he believes that when you manipulate the electromagnetic properties of the 0-point field, that's how you get the UAP activity. Let's explain that. So the ZPF is all around it. It's the medium, and so if you think of a craft, it creates its own electromagnetic properties, which then it can contract that ZPF or the medium and expand it behind it. So in sense, it's not actually moving at all. It's in one pocket. That's why it has no G-force or acceleration. Why if you were in there and you're going the speeds that you're not going to explode into oblivion, and actually it's the medium around it that's moving. That's why they can go into water. There's no sonic booms, etc. But on the outside looking in, that's how we visually see it just shoot off into space. Now, I'm not going to get into the specifics, but Herbert Smithite was discovered in December 20th, 2012, coincidentally. But a later variation of that is this material, which does a quantum spin. It's a 3D lattice, and essentially it creates its own ZPF. It's like a separate server that has its own reality inside, which is the first of its kind, and it's more stable. Now, this is absolute zero. It's in a vacuum, so it's super small scale. But if you were to be able to scale this up, that's how you get to this UAP activity.
If you start with this shit, with the particles and the electrons and the shit, if you start this shit, you're getting let me tell you right now, you're getting kidnapped.
The best way to explain how the 0-point field interacts with this quantum hologram theory is the invention of the MRI. They have really strong magnets. They point at your body. Your hydrogen atoms point up, and they send a radio wave pulse that disrupts what they're doing. And so then the hydrogen atoms, as they're reorienting themselves back to the magnet, they have really strong receivers or very sensitive receivers that measure the orientation, spin, and EMP, electromagnetic properties of these particles, and then they generate an image. Why this works is because each particle orients itself differently, which then transfers information on how it's surrounded in the structure. So back to our medium, the ZPF right here contains all this information. Now, it was proven through the MRI, but the additional theory or the step here is that orientation, spin, and electromagnetic properties are coming from all pieces of matter and are stored in the ZPF, accessible through all of time and all of space. Entanglement essentially is that when you have two electrons purposely designed so that when one spin is up, the other spin is down, and you send them millions of miles apart, whenever you measure that other one, the spin, then the other is that opposite. It is 100% of the time. That is quantum entanglement. Now, to explain superposition, let's look at the double slit experiment. The idea is that you have two slits, you send a ray of light through them, and you would imagine that you would have two bands where the light would be. But in practice, what happens is that it's a wave, and you see multiple bands because they cancel each other out in some weird way. They even tried it with individual particles, and it still did this. But when you observe it, they only go right where the slits are. Meaning it stops being in superposition, it could be anywhere, and it starts being exactly where you see it. So again, no observation, wave function. Observation, particle. Another way to explain this is Schrodinger's cat, where essentially it's in superposition because it could be alive or dead, and you're not sure until you open the box to check. This bleeds into Thomas Campbell's big theory of everything, where he suggests that if, for example, you aim a telescope at the sky and a place that nobody's ever seen before, you have a probability or probability waves of seeing specific things. Now, once you look through that telescope, those probability waves collapse and it becomes reality, and thus anybody else who looks at that place in space will see what you saw. So if information exists on every particle and it exists for every piece of matter and it all is stored in the ZPF, then any time that something is observed, it becomes reality. Now think of this, if you know cybersecurity, when anything happens in your computer, you have a log. What that goes into is a SIM. Now that SIM is essentially a source to say who's doing what when. Think of the ZPF just like a SIM. Now, Penrose's OR theory of consciousness is that quantum computing or superposition is existing within your microtubules in your brain. And essentially, once that superposition collapses onto one event or the other, that's a conscious moment where you are making a decision of reality. Now, in my mind, that's the probability waves. You are observing things, and once you make an observation of what you think is happening, that becomes reality, which is a log, which then goes into your SIM, which is the ZPF. So let me zoom back out. The quantum hologram theory is basically that consciousness is fundamental. It is not emergent. We are all tapping into the ZPF, which is consciousness, and that the idea is in everyday life, we don't pick up on this noise because we have other things going on. And this is where we get into resonance. Ed Mitchell calls it phase conjugate adaptive resonance, or PCAR, which essentially is sonar. Imagine a bat where he sends a signal out and it bounces back. Then we get into tuning our consciousness via meditation or psychedelic states, which helps us dissolve that filter and gives us access to the entirety of the ZPF. If you're thinking about it as a SIM, a log aggregator of every conscious decision or observation, you can also think of this filter as a firewall, which has different configurations based on your state. And if you think of this PCAR, then you can think of the sonar that you're putting out as intention. And through intention, you can dial into whatever source log you're looking for. Now, Danny Goller did an experiment where he would give people DMT and they would look through this laser on different materials, and each specific material, as people would report over and over and over again, had the exact same source code, which then you could allude to the fact that that is the source, and whenever it's observed or changed, it would send a log to the SIM, which you could access through the ZPF when in higher states. Now, we look at it in IT terms. You have your larger consciousness system, which is your AWS or your cloud hosting provider, where everything else happens on top of. You have your ZPF or your zero-point field, which is your SIM or your log aggregator that you can see historical changes within that system. You have your individual experiencers, which are your users with access controls based on their configuration, health, genetics, etc. And when you get into elevated states via DMT or psilocybin, you get permission escalation. So carry that context. Intention equals search queries in the ZPF. Your telepathy or your non-human intelligence context is like you remote desktop where you got that IP address from the ZPF and now you're communicating, or your remote viewing is you have specific logs from the SIM that you're looking for. Now I got one question. Are we in a fucking simulation?